Let's get started with our first startup. Helping to end credential breaches with trustless authentication. Please welcome Head of Strategy and Operations from NuID, Ethan Landau. And welcome. Right. Here's a clicker. You have the power. You have 5 minutes. Your time begins now.
Awesome. I'm going to jump right into it. First, thank you everyone for being here. Special thank you to the judges, the Sharks. Really appreciate it. So, I want to talk about a structural problem with the internet today. I could spend my entire 5 minutes rattling off the names of businesses that have had major credential data breaches in the last 12 months. The thing is, while it's easy to point the finger at these companies, they are also victims of a system that relies on centralized data storage. And that system is authentication. Whether it's a few hundred employees or millions of customers, businesses have to centrally store and protect their users' passwords and other private authentication data. And keeping all this valuable information in one place leads to tremendous risk. We've seen the unfortunate consequence of that, of course, with these constant data breach headlines. Last year, 57% of data breaches included passwords, which is more than addresses, social security numbers, and credit card numbers combined. On the other side, for the user, because every service is requiring a separate set of authentication credentials, users end up with dozens of passwords and usernames, and the user experience for identity is fragmented and frustrating. And both of these problems, the centralized risk for businesses and the fragmented experience for users, is rooted in the shared secret model of authentication. By requiring users to trust every service that they log into with a private value, usually a password, we're placing the costly burden on those companies to store and protect that information. So at NuID, we are trying to solve this core problem with something we call trustless authentication. And I do want to explain that trustless does not mean untrustworthy. What we mean by trustless is that users no longer need to trust anyone with private authentication data when they're logging in. And we achieve this with two novel pieces of technology. The first are zero-knowledge proofs. And a zero-knowledge proof is a cryptographic protocol that allows one user or a party in an exchange to prove they know a piece of information without sharing that information or anything about it. So applied to authentication, this actually allows a user to prove they know their password without that password ever leaving their device, going to a server, or being stored with other passwords. Instead, the client device can actually construct this zero-knowledge proof, and that just demonstrates that they know their password without actually revealing any other information. So the second piece of technology that we're using is a blockchain or distributed ledger. And this provides a trustless infrastructure to store and manage these zero-knowledge proofs. While the zero-knowledge proofs are public data and they're not susceptible to offline attack, they still need to be stored somewhere. And the blockchain provides an immutable storage medium that does not require a centralized party to manage that and then take on the centralized risk and trust associated with keeping those proofs. Now, combining these two technologies, kind of the trustless data of zero knowledge and the trustless infrastructure, provides three key benefits for businesses and their users. And the first is, of course, no longer needing to store passwords and other private authentication data, and getting rid of the opportunity for these large-scale credential breaches. The second is that zero-knowledge protocols are very flexible and allow for both password and passwordless authentication factors, such as biometrics and device tokens. So companies can use the right sort of authentication in the right situation and scenario, all without storing any of that private information. And then finally, by tying the user's identity to data on a distributed ledger, a public ledger, they no longer have a one-to-one relationship with every service, and instead have this user-owned and portable digital identity that can be brought from service to service. Now, at NuID, we've built this trustless authentication into a RESTful API and some lightweight client libraries. And our model includes charging companies on a per-user basis, depending on how many users they need to log into their application. We see a total addressable market that really includes any application and service that has to log in users. And a recent report projected that the authentication market is expected to reach $17 billion by 2025. Of course, in the near term, we're expecting to focus on high-risk verticals such as financial services, insurance, and healthcare. And we're really excited to be getting underway with a POC with a household name in the payment processing industry. Finally, with my last 10 seconds, towards the end of this year and beginning of next year, we're excited to get NuID into a self-service and self-deployable model that will allow developers and small businesses to get going with trustless authentication in just a matter of hours. Thank you very much, and I'd like to take some questions from the judges.
All right. Wow, right to the second, Okay. Judges, the death of passwords, a massive TAM. It's on the blockchain. Questions?
Go for it.
Please.
So, a question. When you're thinking, so either for your POC or other potential customers, are you replacing another current technology?
Yes, so in most cases, what we're actually replacing is the homemade technology. So today, a lot of businesses are simply sending passwords over from the client, hashing it with algorithms that they implement themselves, and then storing those hashes sometimes in a SQL database and sometimes in an identity provider. So we're not really displacing as much, say, their authorization provider if they're using some sort of IAM platform. We're mostly displacing the technology that they've built for themselves or that they've been using for decades.
So I'm interested in what kind of friction or lack thereof you introduce into the login mechanism for a user. Everyone's been trained to use usernames and passwords, good, bad, or whatever. What actually takes place at the client device that authenticates them?
Right, so you can kind of think of NuID as sitting below the actual authentication factor level. And by authentication factors, I mean whether you're using a password, the kind of user experience. So you can implement NuID with just passwords. So from the user's perspective, it would be login with username and password. They wouldn't know any difference. The difference is that their password is never leaving that device, and instead a zero-knowledge proof is constructed of that password, which gets rid of having to share the actual sensitive information. That said, you can also use NuID to implement biometrics and other device tokens where you kind of are unlocking a secret that's maybe tied to a phone, and then that is what's being sent. So the user experience is not dependent on NuID, and it's sort of more up to the customer, depending on whether they're looking to move to passwordless or stick with what they're familiar with.
And if you think about taking it into the payment processor, what do they have to do to implement NuID?
Yeah, so with them, the reason we're really excited actually is because they are interested in kind of seeing the benefits that this can bring to beyond just authentication, but to decentralized identity. And so what they're looking to do is actually kind of build an identity that somewhat operates, say, like a login with Google, but it's user-owned, and so that they can kind of add, say that we've checked this person, we've checked their identity, and add that to their identity they can bring with them. So as to what they have to do, in this case, it's a much more collaborative project. Normally, the only kind of interface is really between our API providing the yes/no to the authentication and the client's authorization, whether it's token authorization, whatever they're currently using to kind of manage a session after that. And so that integration is very lightweight. But with this POC, we're actually kind of doing something a little bit more than that.
And do you store the credentials?
Enrique, sorry, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much.
All right.
And now I'm going to ask Teresa. The assistants come. Nathan's waiting in the waiting room. Maybe he's home or maybe he's on a beach somewhere. Give us your advice to Nathan as well as your reaction. So I want your reaction and then advice.
Great. So I thought you did a really good job with answering questions and sticking to the time, which I know is not easy in these kinds of things. Advice would be, I think you did a really good job of explaining what the problem is, but I think most people here are familiar with what the problem is and have read about the breaches, and I would have spent a little bit less time on that and more time on what your solution actually does. So I thought that, again, I thought your answers to Ted's question and Enrique and my questions were spot on, but I think it would have been helpful to have that be in the presentation, like just the last part, you said, here's where we sit in the stack. It doesn't change the user experience if you don't want it to. Questions about where is the zero knowledge proof stored, you know, a little bit of a graphical, architectural, marketectural kind of drawing. I thought that was missing. I also thought that if you're really pretty far along in a POC with a major payments provider, I think that would probably justify one use case slide to sort of show like, okay, look, we are close to being into market and this is what it looks like.
Okay, Teresa, this is where the rubber meets the road. Teresa Gao, are you in?
So I have to say, not at this point. I would want to wait to see how your POC goes, but also which go-to-market motion you end up using, because you talked about an enterprise go-to-market motion, but you also talked about a developer bottoms-up. I think both could have merit, but I'd want to know what kind of business I'm potentially investing in.
Ted Schlein, are you in?
I have a slightly competitive venture that I'm already in. So it
Can merge.
But what I would do is I would let you know to check out that company, and if you felt comfortable knowing that, I would probably want to learn a little bit more because we didn't get into actually how you're implementing the blockchain for this purpose, which I actually think is a very good use of the blockchain. So I certainly would probably ask you to explain a little bit more to me.
Enrique Salem, are you in?
So Ethan, I thought you did a really good job of telling your story. This is a big problem. I mean, I think all of us have looked at ventures that are trying to solve this problem. The reason I'm not in is because I think there's a lot of noise right now. And so what I would focus on is make sure you can just hit the differentiation of what's going to make you very unique and successful against folks who are already in this space.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I really appreciate the feedback and the interest.
Thank you. Well done.
Great.
Neil.
Great job.
Thanks
Thanks
very much.
Appreciate it.
I'll give pounds all around. Thank you.
Thank you.